When fractions and decimals are taught very well and related, percents are much easier for students to understand because they're like fractions and decimals. They represent parts of something, but they're even narrower in their definition. Starting with the very basics, we need to emphasize a few key things when teaching percents. First of all, percent is part of a whole. A whole is 100%. Whatever we're talking about, whether it be an object or an amount, a whole is 100%. Percent means out of 100. And again, we want to emphasize to students that cent word. We want them to think about all the other words they know that start with cent so that they can make that connection. We can teach them the percent sign. And as a little trick, we can say, look at that percent sign. What do you see in it? What are its parts? I see a line and I see two circles. That can remind us that percent, whether it's written this way or whether it's written as a symbol, means out of 100. We also want to make sure we relate it to decimals. We would read this decimal as 54 hundredths. Hundredths tells us that it's out of 100. We would read this as 54%. Percent tells us that it's out of 100. So it's just two different ways to say exactly the same thing. We can use a base 10 block to look at percents because as we used with decimals, we see 100 small blocks. So this total block represents our 100%. As with all math concepts, we want our students to work with manipulatives, with concrete objects at first. So they can use the blocks, the big squares, as 100%. They can use the tens strips as tenths, and they can use what we usually call the ones as 100th blocks, just as they did with decimals. So if we ask them to take blocks, base 10 blocks, and show us 53%, we might actually have them take the 10 strips and put them on top of the 100% block. So they'd put one strip here, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then they could add the hundredths, 1, 2, 3, to show 53%. Once they've worked with manipulatives, they could actually use grid paper and they could shade in to show percent. So if we ask them to show 3%, 1, 2, 3, they would show 3 of these little hundredth blocks. This would be 3%. They can see that 3% is not very much. It's very easy for them to visualize percent when they use either base 10 blocks or grid paper with shading. As we're teaching percent, we want to make sure we're taking the time to tell students why percent is important. We use percent a lot in our world because it makes it easy for us to see things at a glance. For example, if we use a percent pie graph, we can tell just by glancing what we have in our numbers. We can see the biggest piece, we can see the smallest piece, we can see if something is more than half, less than half. It lets us picture things easier. That's why we often have percent. It also helps us to picture a part of either a small group or a very big group. If we say 56% of students loved math and said it was their favorite subject, that might mean 56% of the students in our class, which might mean only 23 students, or it might mean 56% of the students in the entire country in a certain grade, which would be thousands of students. Percentages help us generalize. As with fractions and decimals, we want to make sure that students can convert from fractions to decimals to percents. It's 3 different ways to say the same thing. I tell my students that I have a lot of different names. Some people call me Mrs. Ludke. Some people call me Mom. Some people call me Grandma. Some people call me Dr. Ludke. Some people call me Melissa. I have a lot of different names, but I'm the same person. That's what's true with all of these different math concepts that deal with parts of something. Fractions, decimals, percents, all of those things allow us to give different names to something for different reasons, but they can all be the same. So for example, if we have a decimal that looks like this, we would read it as 72 hundredths. That means 72%. That means 72 out of 100. Or if we simplify that, we could get down to 36/50ths or 18/25ths. If we have a fraction that reads 1/2, that could be 5/10ths, or 5/10ths, or 50/100ths, or 50%. All of those are names for the same amount. If we have a fraction that's 9/10ths, that can't be written in any other way because it can't be simplified. It's already in simplest form. But it could be written as 9/10ths, or 90/100ths, or 90%. If we have 60%, that means 60 out of 100, which means 60/100ths, which could mean 60 over 100, or 6/10ths, or 3/5ths. These are all different ways for us to talk about the same amount. These are the same, these are the same, these are the same, these are the same. And depending on what we're using the names for, we might choose one over the other. Just like there might be times when someone prefers to call me Grandma rather than Mrs. Ludke. Percents are a very good place for us to emphasize with our students that math is all about relationships and that it's real life and that it's authentic. For example, we use percents sometimes in classrooms when we talk about grades or how we're doing in school. If I was a student who took a test and there were 40 questions on the test and I got 32 of the questions correct, I might wonder what my percent is if my teacher uses percents in the classroom. So if I put a table together and I have the parts and the whole, 32 is the number of questions I got correct, that's the part. 40 is the whole. I know that 100% is the whole, and what I don't know is what that would be in the part if I'm thinking about a percent. So I can find this in lots of different ways, and the only thing that matters is that I set up things in relationships in ways that match. So I could say the part that I got right over the whole is the same as the part that's the percent that I don't know over the whole. Or I could set it up this way. I could say the part that I got right over the part that's the percent is the whole on my test over the whole percent. As long as I set up things in ways that are logical, part to part, whole to whole, part on the test, part to percent, to the whole of the test, to the whole of the percent, or any other way, my relationship is going to be correct, and I can solve to find the answer. Percents are also used in sales all over the place. So if I'm buying a winter coat and my coat costs $99, that's almost 100. And if $100 is 100%, that means that each percent is $1. So if the percent off is 60, that means I'm going to save $60, 60%, and my coat is going to cost me $40. What a deal. Percentages help us in the world with many aspects of life. Sometimes teachers will tell me that they don't spend much time on percents in the classroom. And when I ask why this is, usually what they say is they just don't get to it. Time is a problem. I think we need to be very careful to teach fractions, decimals, and percents very well, very clearly, and relate them strongly to each other, because they're used in the world in so many different ways. Our weather reporting, our voting, statistics, polls, sales, all kinds of averages, these are skills that students should know and understand.